The chisel point bit into the granite with a sharp metallic ring that echoed down the valley. Elias Thorne, all of 19 years old and thin as a river reed, braced his legs on the narrow ledge, his knuckles white around the tool's wooden handle. A heavy mallet in his other hand rose and fell in a steady, patient rhythm. Chip, ring, chip, ring. Below him, the valley floor lay 100 feet down, a patchwork of green fields and the silver thread of the Serpentine River. Beside him, panting softly with his tail dusting the rock, sat Barrow, a scruffy dog of indeterminate breed whose intelligent brown eyes missed nothing. Barrow shifted his weight, his claws making a faint scratching sound, and looked from Elias's focused face to the sheer drop, then back again, as if to confirm the sanity of the endeavor. He offered a low whine, a quiet question in the vast silence of the mountain. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. "It'll hold, boy," he said, his voice quiet, barely disturbing the air. It was a promise to the dog and to himself. He was cutting the first of 12 deep mortises into the cliff face, just as the journal specified, his father's journal. The leather-bound book was his only real inheritance, filled with his father's precise, elegant script and detailed architectural drawings that most would call madness. Plans for a house built not on the valley floor, but of the mountain itself, cantilevered out from the sheer granite wall, high above the floodline. A house anchored to the bones of the world. The sound of a horse brought his work to a halt. Down on the valley path, Mr. Abernathy reined in his stout gray mare, tilting his head back until his hat threatened to fall off. He was a man whose 60 years were etched into his face by sun and winter. A man who believed in foundations you could walk around, in 4 solid walls on flat, sensible ground. "Elias!" he shouted, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. "What in God's name are you doing up there, trying to build a nest like a sparrow?" Elias set down his mallet. He did not shout back. He waited for the man to dismount and make his way up the steep, winding goat path to the ledge. Barrow stood, a low rumble in his chest, until Elias placed a calming hand on his back. Abernathy arrived, breathing heavily, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. He looked at the shallow cut in the rock, at the ropes and tools laid out with neat precision. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen," Abernathy said, shaking his head. He gestured down toward the fertile land below, where his own sturdy farmhouse sat. "There's good land down there, son. Your father left you that plot by the river, solid ground. Why are you wasting your time scratching at a rock face?" Elias picked up a plumb bob, letting it hang still to check his vertical line. "Building a home," he replied, his voice even. "A home, that's a perch for an eagle, not a home for a man. Wait until the first big wind. The mountain will shrug you off like a fly." He squinted at the sky, a practiced, weather-worn gaze. "Winter's coming on. You'll freeze to death on this rock before you even get a roof up. Come down, boy. I'll give you work on my farm. You can stay in the spare room until you're on your feet." It was a kind offer, born of genuine worry. Elias appreciated the kindness, but not the advice. He looked at the valley floor, at the placid river. He saw it not as it was now, in the gentle sun of late summer, but as his father's journal described it, a raging, churning monster that, every 20 years or so, sought to reclaim the entire valley in a torrent of melted snow and ice. His own mother had been taken by such a flood when he was a boy, a memory as sharp and cold as the chisel in his hand. "I have a plan," Elias said. He turned back to his work, placing the chisel against the granite. Abernathy watched him for another long minute, the rhythmic chipping starting up again. He sighed, a sound of profound exasperation. "Stubborn, just like your father. He was always filling his books with impossible ideas. Don't let his dreams be the death of you." He turned and made his way back down the path, his boots scuffing on the loose shale. The next day, Mayor Thompson arrived. He did not climb the path, but observed from the valley floor through a small brass spyglass, his fine waistcoat and polished boots a stark contrast to the wild landscape. He was a man who measured worth in acres and coin, and he saw Elias's project as an affront to productivity. He'd sent a message with a boy from the town. It was simple and direct. "Cease this foolishness. You are a blight on the landscape and an embarrassment to your family's name. The town council will not sanction this structure." Elias read the note, folded it neatly, and used it to shim a wobbly toolbox. Mrs. Gable came on a Sunday, her face etched with a motherly concern that was almost harder to bear than the men's scorn. She brought a basket with fresh bread and a jar of preserves. She stood on the ledge, clutching her shawl, refusing to look down. "Elias, dear," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Your parents were good people. They wouldn't want this for you. This isn't safe. What if you fall? Who will care for you? Who will even find you?" "I won't fall," Elias said, accepting the bread with a nod of thanks. Barrow sniffed the basket, his tail giving a hopeful thump against the rock. "But the winter, the ice," she pressed. "This place will be a tomb of ice." "It'll be warm," he said. He pointed to a marking on the rock, a precise circle. "The flue goes here. Cut right through the stone." She just shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "We're all so worried for you." He did not know how to answer her worry. He could not show her the calculations in the journal, the stress diagrams, the thermal analysis of the granite shelf, the detailed study of wind patterns his father had recorded over a decade. They were just ink on paper. They were just impossible ideas. So he said nothing. He simply went back to work, the steady ring of hammer on steel his only reply. The sound echoed across the valley, a lonely, stubborn percussion. It was the sound of a promise being kept. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows that swallowed the valley floor, Elias and Barrow sat on the ledge, sharing a piece of Mrs. Gable's bread. The first mortise was 6 inches deep, 11 more to go. The work had just begun. Weeks bled into months. The sun of late summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The valley below was a riot of color, but Elias saw only the gray of the granite, the grain of the timber, the glint of his tools. The work was his entire world. After cutting the 12 deep mortises, each one a perfect 4-foot-deep rectangle that took days of relentless labor, he began the terrifying task of setting the main support beams. They were old-growth pine, felled from the high ridge behind the cliff, trees his father had selected 20 years prior. They were seasoned, dense, and impossibly heavy. Getting them from the ridge to the ledge was a feat of engineering in itself. He built a wooden sled and a system of block and tackle, using Barrow as an anchor by tying the main rope to a harness around the dog's sturdy frame. The dog seemed to understand his role, digging his paws into the earth, leaning into the weight, his muscles trembling with effort. Elias guided the massive beams down the steep slope, one painstaking foot at a time, his own body aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in his bones. Then came the hoisting. He had to lift the end of each 24-foot beam, swing it out over the 100-foot drop, and guide it into a mortise. He built a small, sturdy derrick on the ledge, its arm extending out into the void. He would wrap the beam in chains, crank the winch until the wood groaned in protest, and with agonizing slowness maneuver the massive timber into place. His hands, raw and blistered in the first weeks, were now covered in a thick layer of calluses, crisscrossed with healed-over cuts. He bled on the wood. He bled on the stone. He felt as if he were mixing a part of himself into the very structure of the house. During one such operation, as he guided a particularly heavy beam toward its socket, the main rope slipped on the winch drum. The beam plunged 3 feet in a sickening lurch, its immense weight tearing the winch handle from his grasp. The handle spun with vicious speed, catching his arm with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up to his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back against the cliff face, his arm hanging useless at his side. The beam swung precariously over the abyss. Barrow barked, a frantic, high-pitched sound. For a long moment, Elias simply breathed, fighting back the waves of nausea and blackness. He couldn't afford to fall. He couldn't afford to fail. He looked at his arm. It was already swelling, a deep, ugly purple blooming beneath the skin. Broken. He was sure of it. He gritted his teeth, the pain a living thing inside him. Using his good hand, he painstakingly, carefully, began to work the winch brake, securing the rope. It took him nearly an hour. Only when the beam was secure did he allow himself to slide down the rock face and sit, cradling his shattered arm. That evening, he set the bone himself, using 2 flat pieces of kindling as a splint and tearing strips from his own shirt for binding. The pain was excruciating. He bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, sweat pouring down his face. Barrow licked his cheek, whining softly, a warm and constant presence in a world of agony. For 3 days, he could do nothing but lie on the ledge, feverish, tending the fire, his body shivering with shock and pain. The work stopped. The valley was silent. He saw Mr. Abernathy watching him through the spyglass from below. He expected a shout of, "I told you so." None came. Instead, the next morning, a basket was waiting for him at the bottom of the path. It contained a bottle of whiskey, a tin of salve, and clean linen bandages. There was no note. The injury cost him 2 weeks. He learned to work one-handed, his movements slow and clumsy. He focused on smaller tasks, sharpening tools, organizing his supplies, planning the next phase of construction. He read his father's journal again, not just the plans, but the entries. They mistake patience for idleness, his father had written. They see a man watching the river and think he is lazy. They do not see that he is learning its nature. To build something that lasts, you must first understand what it is that will try to destroy it. During this time, Maeve started visiting. She was the miller's daughter, with quiet eyes that held no judgment, only a deep and genuine curiosity. She would bring him books from the town's small library, a hot meal wrapped in cloth, or news from the valley. She never told him he was foolish. She never told him to stop. She would simply sit on the edge of the growing platform, her legs dangling over the drop, and watch him work. "How did you learn to tie knots like that?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to the intricate web of ropes securing a new beam. "My father's journal," he said, pulling a rope tight with his good hand and his teeth. It has a chapter on it, a knot for every purpose. He must have been a very clever man. He was, Elias said. It was the most he had spoken to anyone, save Barrow, in months. Her presence was a quiet comfort. She saw the pain he was in, the exhaustion etched on his face. One day, she arrived with her father's saw and a small, sharp axe. Without a word, she began cutting the firewood he had dragged to the ledge into manageable lengths, stacking it neatly against the cliff wall. She worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, and for the first time, the sound of another's labor joined his own. They worked in a comfortable silence, two people engaged in a shared purpose. When his arm finally healed enough to bear weight, he began building the floor. He laid thick joists across the main beams, nailing down heavy 2-inch thick planks of cured oak. With every board he secured, the perch became a platform. The platform became a floor. It felt solid under his feet, an impossible island in the air. He could walk from one end to the other without touching the mountain. He and Barrow would sleep there at night, wrapped in blankets, the stars above so close and brilliant they seemed near enough to touch. The frame of the house went up next. The walls took shape, skeletal at first, then slowly sheathed in wood. He built a roof with a steep pitch, designed to shed the heaviest snow. He left a space for a single, large window that would look out over the entire valley. From his vantage point, he watched the life of the town unfold. He saw Abernathy bringing in his harvest. He saw Mayor Thompson's carriage kicking up dust on the main road. He saw the smoke rising from Mrs. Gable's chimney. They were all still down there, on their solid, sensible ground, living their lives, while he built his impossible house in the sky. The mockery had faded, replaced by a kind of grudging, silent observation. He was no longer just the foolish boy. He was a landmark, a strange and stubborn feature of the landscape. One evening, as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from a slate-gray sky, Maeve pointed to the west. "The geese are gone," she said. "Mr. Abernathy says he hasn't seen the sky this color since the winter of the Great Flood." Elias stopped hammering. He looked west. The clouds were a bruised purple, heavy and low. The air had a strange, still quality to it, a silence that felt like a held breath. He looked at his house. The walls were up, the roof was on, but the window was just a gaping hole, and the flue for the stove was not yet complete. There was still so much to do. "I have to work faster," he said. "You can't," Maeve replied, her voice firm. "You're one man, Elias. You're already working from sunup to sundown." He looked at his hands, at the calluses layered on top of scars. He looked at the growing stack of firewood Maeve had helped him cut. He looked at Barrow, who was sniffing the air, a low whine escaping his throat. The dog knew, the mountain knew, and deep in his gut, Elias knew too. The test was coming. The very thing his father had designed this house to withstand was gathering its strength far to the west. He had not built a house. He had built an ark, and the storm was coming to find it. He worked with a feverish intensity that bordered on panic. The first snows were light, a dusting that melted by midday, but they were a warning. He devoted every moment of daylight to finishing the most critical tasks. Maeve, sensing his urgency, began coming every day. She learned to mix mortar for the flue, her small hands surprisingly deft with the trowel. Together, they painstakingly sealed the seams of the cabin with a mixture of pitch and sawdust, working by lantern light long after the sun had set. The gaping hole for the window was his greatest worry. He had the glass. A single thick pane hauled up the mountain at great risk, but setting it was a delicate operation that required time he did not have. Instead, he built a heavy storm shutter of layered oak planks, reinforcing it with a crossbeam of ironwood. It was ugly and crude, plunging the cabin's interior into near darkness when closed. But it was strong. He spent 2 days just on the hinges and the locking mechanism, ensuring it could withstand a direct assault from the wind. "It looks like a fortress," Maeve said, her voice echoing in the small, dark space. "It has to be," Elias replied, testing the heavy bar that locked the shutter in place. Mr. Abernathy rode by again, not shouting this time, but stopping at the base of the path. He looked up at the finished structure, a dark, angular shape clinging to the cliff face. It was no longer a madman's perch. It was a thing of substance. He studied the sky, his expression grim. "That wind from the west has a bite to it I don't like, son," he called up. "It's the kind that carries heavy snow, then turns warm and brings the rain. That's flood weather." It was not a warning meant to mock, but a piece of hard-won wisdom freely given, an offering of peace. "I know," Elias called back. "I'm ready." Abernathy nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his old eyes. "I hope you are." The storm arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. A week before midwinter, the snow began to fall. It was not the light, feathery snow of early winter, but a thick, wet, heavy snow that fell without pause. For 3 days and 3 nights, it buried the world in a blanket of white. The valley disappeared. The trees became white sculptures. The air was thick with it, a relentless, silent descent that muffled all sound. Inside the cabin, Elias and Maeve kept the small iron stove burning hot. The stone flue, now complete, drew perfectly, channeling the smoke out and up the cliff face. The cabin was warm and dry, an island of life in the frozen world. Barrow lay curled by the hearth, content. They had supplies, sacks of flour, salted meat, dried beans, and the firewood Maeve had helped stack, which now seemed like the most precious treasure on earth. They were sealed in, but they were safe. Through a small peephole Elias had drilled in the shutter, he could see the snow piling up. It was easily 10 feet deep on the valley floor, and still it fell. The weight was immense. He heard the distant crack and groan of trees shedding heavy branches. He worried about the roof, but his father's steep-pitch design worked as intended. The snow would accumulate to a certain depth, then slide off in a great, harmless avalanche into the abyss below. On the 4th day, the character of the storm changed. As Abernathy had predicted, the wind shifted. It came from the west, and it was warm, a Chinook. The temperature rose 20 degrees in a matter of hours. The sound of the world changed from a muffled silence to a steady, universal dripping. And then the rain began. A hard, driving rain falling on 10 feet of dense snow. Elias knew what was happening. Every gully and ravine on the mountainsides was becoming a river. The snowpack was turning into a saturated sponge, releasing its water all at once. The Serpentine River, trapped under a thick layer of ice and snow, would soon be overwhelmed. "Listen," Maeve whispered, her face pale in the lantern light. Beneath the sound of the rain and the wind, a new sound was emerging. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very rock they were anchored to. It was the sound of the valley dying. Elias unbarred the heavy shutter and pushed it open a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from his grasp. He peered out. The world was a maelstrom of gray cloud and driving rain. But it was the valley floor that held his attention. It was no longer white. It was a churning brown mass. The Serpentine River had broken its banks and was rising with terrifying speed. He could see the tops of trees swaying violently, not from the wind, but from the force of the current tearing at their roots. The rumble grew to a deafening roar. He saw a dark shape, Abernathy's barn, lift from its foundation and turn over, disintegrating into a mass of floating timbers. The water wasn't just rising. It was a tidal wave of melted snow, mud, and debris scouring the valley floor. His father's land, the solid ground Abernathy had advised him to build on, was now under 15 feet of raging water. "Close it," Maeve said, her voice tight with fear. Elias secured the shutter, plunging them back into the warm, dim safety of the cabin. The noise was immense, a constant grinding roar that vibrated through the floorboards. The wind hammered at the walls, shrieking as it found no purchase on the smooth, angled surfaces. The cabin groaned under the strain. A fine dusting of rock powder fell from where the beams met the cliff face. Barrow pressed against Elias's leg, trembling. "It'll hold," Elias said, his voice a low anchor in the chaos. He repeated the words he had spoken to his dog months ago, on the first day. "It'll hold." He put his hand on the granite wall at the back of the cabin. It was cold and solid, utterly indifferent to the storm. It was the bones of the world, and they were holding fast. Hours passed. The roaring outside did not subside. As darkness fell, Elias lit a second lantern and hung it outside, just under the shelter of the roof eaves. It was a tiny pinprick of light against an immense, violent darkness, but it was a signal, a beacon, a declaration that here, on this impossible perch, there was still life, there was still shelter. It was near midnight when he heard a new sound, a desperate shouting, barely audible over the storm. He opened the shutter again. In the wild, swinging light of the lantern, he saw them, figures dark and struggling, clinging to the goat path that was now a muddy, treacherous waterfall. They were climbing. He grabbed a coil of rope. "Stay here," he told Maeve. He secured one end of the rope to a heavy iron anchor bolt inside the cabin door and threw the other end down the path. The first person to grab it was Mr. Abernathy. His face was a mask of mud and terror, his clothes torn. He was supporting his wife, who was weeping uncontrollably. Elias and Maeve hauled them up the last few feet and onto the solid floor of the cabin. More people were coming. Mrs. Gable, her face streaked with tears, clutching a small, shivering child who wasn't her own. Mayor Thompson, his fine clothes ruined, his face slack with shock. His grand house, the finest in the valley, was gone. He had lost everything but the clothes on his back. One by one, Elias pulled them in. The survivors of the flood, the very people who had mocked and scorned his endeavor, were now seeking refuge within its walls. There were 12 of them in the small cabin, crowded together, dripping, shivering, and silent. There were no words of thanks, not yet. They were too stunned, too deep in shock. Elias said nothing. He simply stoked the fire, while Maeve handed out dry blankets and cups of hot, sweet tea. He moved among them, tending to a cut on a child's leg, helping Abernathy splint a twisted ankle. His actions were simple, practical, and devoid of any hint of triumph or vindication. He was not their savior. He was just a man in a sturdy house, and his door was open. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cliff-face cabin, humanity huddled together, warm and safe, anchored to the rock. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped, and the wind had softened to a mournful sigh. The silence it left behind was profound and heavy. Elias unbarred the shutter and pushed it open. No one spoke. They gathered at the opening, a small crowd of survivors, and looked out upon their world. It was gone. The valley floor was a wasteland, a churning sea of brown water and debris. Entire farms had vanished. The town itself was a ruin, with only the stone church steeple visible above the flood. The sturdy bridges were gone. The old-growth trees that had lined the river for centuries were gone. Everything they had built, everything they had believed to be permanent and safe, had been washed away. Only the high ridges and the mountainsides remained, and the cabin, clinging to its rock face, untouched. Mr. Abernathy was the first to speak. He stood beside Elias, his shoulders slumped, his face aged 20 years in a single night. He looked at the solid floorboards beneath his feet, at the massive beams disappearing into the granite wall. He put a hand on Elias's shoulder. His voice was hoarse, choked with emotion. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice breaking. "Your father, he wasn't a dreamer. He was a prophet. He saw this. And you," he shook his head, a look of utter awe on his face, "you're a better builder than any of us. You listened." Mayor Thompson, his face pale and haggard, stood staring at the wreckage of his fortune. He turned to Elias, his eyes stripped of all their former arrogance. "My family is safe in the next town, thank God. But everything else, my house was built of stone, a fortress. I thought it would stand for 100 years. He gestured weakly at the cabin. This is the only fortress." Gable, holding the sleeping child, simply reached out and squeezed Elias's arm, her eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that no words could capture. In the days that followed, the water slowly receded, leaving behind a thick, foul-smelling layer of mud and a landscape of unimaginable devastation. The cabin became a command center. Its floor was the only dry, flat surface for miles. Its warmth was a beacon for other survivors who emerged from the high hills. Elias, Maeve, and the others organized search parties, tended to the injured, and took stock of what little they had left. The community, shattered and grieving, began to coalesce around the impossible cabin. They saw not just a shelter, but a lesson. The knowledge that had been dismissed as madness was now their only hope. One afternoon, as a group of men sat around the stove, defeated, Abernathy spoke up. "There's no point rebuilding down there," he said, his voice firm. "The river has taken it. It will take it again. We have to build like this." He slapped the solid granite wall at the back of the cabin. "We have to build with the mountain, not just on it." Elias, who had been listening quietly, went to a small wooden chest in the corner. He brought out his father's journal and laid it on the table. He opened it to a page filled with designs, not just for one house, but for a whole village of structures built into the high, stable slopes of the valley. There were plans for terraced farming, for water collection systems, for homes anchored to bedrock. It was a blueprint for survival, a legacy of foresight. "He left a plan," Elias said simply. The men crowded around, their faces a mixture of wonder and reverence. They looked at the elegant script, the precise drawings. Mayor Thompson, who had once called these ideas an embarrassment, now traced a design for a cantilevered foundation with a trembling finger. "It's all here," he whispered. "The math, the geology." He knew. He looked at Elias. "Will you teach us?" Elias nodded, and so the rebuilding began, not in the valley, but on its slopes. Guided by the journal and by Elias's quiet, steady hand, the people of Serpentine Valley began to construct a new town. They learned to read the rock, to understand the wind, to respect the power of the water. They cut mortises into the granite, set anchors deep into the earth, and built homes that were strong and safe. Elias did not lead with speeches or commands. He led with his hammer and his chisel, working alongside the others, showing them how to tie the knots, how to brace a beam, how to build something that would last. The valley that had once echoed with the lonely sound of his labor now rang with the sounds of a whole community working together, a symphony of saws and hammers building a new future. The cliff-face cabin became a school, a town hall, and a symbol of their resilience. It was the first house of the new Serpentine Valley, the one that had shown them the way. Years passed. The valley healed. The raw scars of the flood were slowly covered by green grass and young trees. The new town thrived, a collection of sturdy, sensible structures nestled into the slopes, safe above the river's reach. The story of the Great Flood and the boy who built the ark became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the wisdom of listening to the mountain. Elias and Maeve married. They lived in the cliff-face cabin, raising 2 children who learned to be as sure-footed as mountain goats on the winding path. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, filled with the warmth of family and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. Elias never lost his quiet nature, but his short, declarative sentences were now regarded as words of profound wisdom. He became the keeper of his father's knowledge, the man the community turned to when they needed to know how to build something that would endure. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned gray. His steps became slow and careful. He spent most of his days sleeping by the hearth, the same spot he had claimed during the great storm. He was a constant, living link to the cabin's beginnings, a silent witness to all that had passed. One quiet spring morning, Elias found him lying in his usual spot, having passed peacefully in his sleep. His breathing had simply stopped. The loss was a quiet, immense ache in the heart of the home. Elias wrapped the old dog in a soft blanket and carried him outside. He buried him on a small, flat piece of ground near the cabin's entrance, overlooking the rebuilt valley. He carved a simple stone to mark the spot. It read, "Barrow, a good and faithful friend." He would often stand there in the evenings, his hand on the cool stone, looking out at the lights of the town he had helped save, a town that would not exist without the stubborn labor of one boy and his dog. Time continued its relentless, steady march. Elias's children grew up and built their own homes nearby, anchored to the same principles of their grandfather. Elias taught his grandchildren how to read the weather in the clouds, how to select the strongest timber, how to respect the power of the mountain. He saw the wisdom of his father's journal passed down, becoming not just a family legacy, but the common sense of the entire community. His hands, once calloused and strong, became gnarled with age, but they were never idle. He grew old in the house he had built. His hair turned the color of the winter snow. His movement slowed, but his eyes remained clear and sharp. He had watched the valley be destroyed and then reborn. He had seen mockery turn to reverence and doubt turn to faith. He had lived a full and meaningful life, anchored to the rock. On a cold winter's night, with a gentle snow falling outside, Elias Thorne died as peacefully as his old dog had, surrounded by his family in the warm, safe cabin. He was 87 years old. His last breath was a quiet sigh of contentment. He had done the work he was meant to do. He had honored his father's vision. He had built a home that became a haven, and a haven that became a legacy. They buried him next to Barrow, on the cliff that held his life's work. The whole town came to pay their respects, climbing the familiar path not in fear or desperation, but in solemn gratitude. Mr. Abernathy's grandson, a master carpenter himself, carved the headstone. He did not need many words. Below the name and dates, he chiseled the simple epitaph the town had chosen: Elias Thorne. He built on the rock. Decades later, the town of Serpentine Valley continued to prosper, a testament to the enduring power of unconventional wisdom. The story of its founding was known to every child, and high on the cliff face, a landmark against the sky, the old cabin still stood. Its timbers were weathered to a silver gray. Its stone flue was dark with the soot of 100 winters, but it remained as solid and unyielding as the day it was built. It endured the wind. It endured the snow. It endured the rain. It had become a part of the mountain itself, a quiet, stubborn monument to the boy who listened to his father, and to the enduring strength of a promise kept.